I'd like to open Matthew chapter 25. We'll be looking at a couple of verses there in the middle of the parable that Jesus tells on the parable of the talents. Kind of a springboard for a topic that I want to talk about that is highlighted by one of the characters in the parable only. Some people follow cartoons in the newspapers and all, and some used to. And I'm not a big pursuer of those kind of things, but one of the ones that I enjoyed reading from time to time when I happened to pick up the newspaper was Peanuts. Whether he was in your paper or not at different times, but everybody likes the character Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown had a variety of different things, and one of the unique things about him was that he's a whole lot like us in a variety of different ways. Now, there are other characters in the comic strip, but the failures of Charlie Brown and the things that he strived to do seem to, at least in some way or another, reach out and portray each of us at different points in time. One of the big things that Charlie Brown had problems with was his I guess you'd say, his attitude about achieving things. He just really wasn't outgoing. Matter of fact, to go along with what we're talking about tonight, he had a fear of failure. He didn't like to try things. And so it just kind of represents what our society's about in a lot of ways. And us, even as Christians, that concept of fear of failure. When Jesus tells a parable in Matthew chapter 25, matter of fact, all three parables that he describes here, he's talking in each of the situations about the judgment. The first parable is about what's described sometimes as the wise and the foolish virgins, but it deals with a judgment scene where some people weren't prepared. The second parable, last part, is talking about the Son of Man judging the nations at the end of the world. It's not exactly like a parable, but it talks about what judgment is going to be done over and how it's going to be done over small things. But the second part, or the next parable after the wise and foolish virgins, is the parable of the talents, beginning in verse 14. And the story goes that there's a kingdom. Of course, we're talking about a parallel or a symbolism here. A kingdom of heaven's like a man who is traveling to some far country. He's put different servants in charge of managing some things. And he says, take care of these things, and when I come back, we will look at the accounts and see how things are going, basically. And so as you're looking at it, he gives one a certain amount of talents, one a little bit less amount of talents, and the third fellow just gets one talent. Now, this is not talking about abilities here. It's referring to a sum of gold money. And so, but each one is getting this responsibility of taking care of this money according to the ability he has. And one that has more abilities, give him more money to manage. And one that has medium or average abilities, give him an average amount. And the one that doesn't have a lot of talents, then it's just given one talent of money or one sum of money. When you come down to the characters as the Lord comes back, and each one of them comes back, you find that the 5-talent fellow in verse 20 has done well. He's brought back the money that the Lord gave him, and plus he's prospered and he's done much better. And the Lord is happy about that, and he talks about, well done, good and faithful servant. Does the same thing with the next talent fellow, who didn't receive quite as many as the 5-talent fellow, but nonetheless, he did well too. Then we come down to the third talent, verse 25. Verse 24, really, the 1-talent man, he came to the Lord and he said he knew that the Lord was a hard man. And he reaped where he didn't sow, and he gathered where he had not scattered seed. Now that's really probably not an accurate description of Jesus Christ in any way, or God. And yet, as the man is starting out to tell why he didn't do what he was supposed to do, he starts out, as we mentioned this morning, blaming somebody else for his actions. But then I think he reveals something about himself in verse 25. He says, and I was afraid. And I went and I hid your talent in the ground with some money. He said, look, I still have what's yours. He's not squandered it. You think about the parable of the prodigal son that went off and just wasted everything that was his inheritance. He didn't do that. He didn't lose it. He didn't misplace it. He didn't lose it gambling. He still had it. He'd taken good care of it. But he didn't add anything to it. And the reason that nothing was done with it, according to what he's saying here, was, I was afraid. And so I want to talk about that just for a few moments tonight, because sometimes I think, at least in part, it identifies any one of us at different times in our life. And I'm guilty. And you think, you're guilty. You're the one that's willing to step up and talk in front of people when supposedly that's one of the greatest fears that individuals have, is public speaking. Well, at this moment, yeah, okay, that might be true, but I have my fears. And there are times, even in private conversation, I can almost feel a nudge, like, go ahead, David, speak up, tell them about God. And it's just kind of like, I don't know if they're going to like me. I have my fears. And all of us have in different points in time. And I thought, let's talk about this just a bit, as each one of us looks at our life and analyzes that we don't wind up like this guy here making excuses before the Lord in the judgment seat, saying, well, I didn't do that because I was afraid. Now, this guy lost out entirely. And I guess maybe just in setting the stage, I don't think being fearful at one point or another is going to cause us to lose our soul. But what it could cause us to do is not accomplish as much as we'd like to. What it could cause us to do after, I know, in certain situations where I've walked away and I thought, I'm kicking myself inside thinking, I should have done that. I could have spoke out, or why didn't I? And I just didn't feel like I measured up like I should. In different settings and different times, and it just doesn't quite give me the feeling that I ought to have because of my failures. And so I just want to talk about it for just a moment here. And talking about that, first of all, let me say this here, a little quote that came along in a lesson talking about failure and fears of it, from Thomas Edison. He said, many of life's failures are people who didn't realize how close they were to success when they gave up. Now this is leading into part of what we do in our failing, because we will try some things, but eventually we just it's not doing any good, and we give up, or we're fearful about what's going on, and we don't get done because we didn't persist in doing that. Now, here's what, in looking at this, that I want to think about. Give me a true-false on this, in your mind or in your heart. God's people should be risk-takers. True or false? True. Anybody false? I just got a trick question here. Could be. Let me analyze it from this standpoint, putting out some individuals here. Because for where I'm looking at it, and I think after you see what I'm talking about, you're going to say true. Let's just look at characters in the Bible here. We can start with some that go back as far as Noah. Genesis chapter 6. When God picked him out, Noah was already, in one sense, a risk taker. In comparison to the rest of the world, he lived so differently than anybody else that he and his family eventually were the only ones that got on the ark. He was a risk taker in the sense because he spent, as best we can tell, 120 years in the building of that ark. And from our understanding, there wasn't one drop of rain that whole time. And capturing how God watered the Garden of Eden from the soil upwards. Whether it was or wasn't rain, that's kind of debatable, but the fact is that huge deluge that God promised didn't show up until the ark was completely done after 120 years. He spent his entire life building a boat in the middle of nowhere. Imagine the Sahara Desert and the people that ridiculed him along the way, the generations of people. Risk taker. Move on down just a little further to Genesis chapter 12, and you encounter a guy named Abraham. And when God talks to him, he says, Abraham, I want you to leave your family, your country, and all your people, and your livelihood. And I want you to pack up, and I'm I want you to go somewhere. I'll tell you when you get there. I'll guide you. Risk taker. I mean, he walked away from it all. And you can move on down to the book of Exodus, and you can look at Abraham. Abraham was a risk taker in the process, and how he trusted in God to do things that he wasn't too sure, Genesis 12, that was going to work out his way. By the way, did I get Moses and Abraham's story turned around here? I sure did. Just realized that. Moses was Exodus chapter 3, 4, and on down through there. Abraham was the one in Genesis 12. Get my names turned around with my children too quite often, but the Lord understands that He does a lot better job than I ever will. But nonetheless, Abraham left his family and home. Moses, risk taker, Exodus 4, who turns around and goes back into Egypt after he run from Pharaoh. Now we're on the right character here. And so here he is going in and talking to Pharaoh and appealing before God and telling Pharaoh what to do. And although he was, at the start with in Exodus chapter 4, very apprehensive and giving all kinds of excuses of why he wasn't qualified, he turns around and he does this as a risk taker. The apostles, when Jesus calls them, moving into the New Testament, each one of them, and learning a little bit about Jesus along the way as he's out preaching, recognizes when the call comes, they left their nets, talking about the fishermen, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. They left their nets and they followed Jesus. They walked away from their family, from their livelihood, and everything else. That's a risk. In one man, can you do those things? Acts chapter 4 and 5, now these men are Christians, and they're preachers of God's Word, and they're out risking even more so when the Pharisees and others are telling them not to preach Jesus, and they go right back in the temple and they do it anyway. Or Acts chapter 8, after the persecution starts on the church. And they were scattered because of it, but they kept on preaching Jesus. They didn't bury themselves in some cave somewhere. And so it's the way I'm looking at what I'm talking about here. I think God expects us to be risk takers for Him, in one way or another. I had a friend that told me some time ago, and I occasionally have mentioned this. He said, once in a while, as Christians, our palms ought to sweat. Just to say, I did something that I don't normally do, and it really tensed me up, but I did it anyway because I just felt like I ought to. And that doesn't mean that everybody's cut out to do every task. But once in a while, I think we ought to say, I'm going to stretch myself for the Lord as a risk taker. And I think the thing that keeps us from doing those things is because there's a fear of failure. And so that's why I want to talk about it. Now, God's people, in taking risks, will recognize that we're going to fail. Matter of fact, point number one as we're looking at this is that everyone fails at some point. But that's the reason a lot of times that we kind of put the block in our mind as we look at something, we're like, oh, that's not going to work. And so we stop right there. Or, I've tried it before and it doesn't work. Or several times through. And so there's that risk, and we have to recognize, number one, that everybody fails. And we fail quite often in that. Matter of fact, in James chapter 3, verse 2, James says, we all stumble in many ways. Now he's talking about sin there, and that's the failure of failures. And so just in the pursuit of trying to follow God, we're not going to be successful 100% of the time. I read the note here, one of the lessons I was reading on this. It says that a study was done recently, and they discovered that the failure rate among human beings is 100%. Does that surprise you? We all fail, in other words. Kind of jokingly, the guy puts the point out. It's not something that's unusual about us. Nobody's perfect. As Paul writes, which should be really, in one sense, an encouraging verse. For we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And does that sound encouraging? Well, in one way it is. Because when we look at ourselves and say, I'm a sinner, and well, I just don't go the next step and say, well, I can't make it. The point is, we're all sinners. But because of that, God's grace comes. and we all have a way out. So the concept of risking things, first of all, we understand that nobody's perfect. We're not going to handle this thing perfectly. Go back to some of these characters in the Old Testament that we were talking about a while ago. They were risk takers. Abraham. Along the way, he did some things that really didn't work out well. I mean, wives, I know you wouldn't appreciate the fact if you're traveling with your husband and some shady character come along the way and your husband said, looks too tough for me. Well, that's my sister, that's not my wife. That's what Abraham did. Knew how good looking she was and was kind of concerned when the king came along that way. So he just flat out said, it's my sister. Well, half true, but still, big fat lie. How about Elijah, who was one of God's greatest prophets, up against the prophets of Baal in Mount Carmel, 450 of them. Elijah all by himself. Great victory. But then right after that, sat there under a broom tree crying because the sun was too bright and this problem, that, and everybody was against him. And it's like, whoa, what happened? Failure. Moses, along the list of many excuses he had, slow of speech. Had to have somebody come along with him, his brother Aaron, who quite often, as far as we can tell, did all the speaking for him. And then there's David. I like the name, except when we have to talk about the bad parts of David. Committed adultery. Tried to cover it up. Tried again to cover it up. Eventually sends Bathsheba's husband into battle to die for the third time trying to cover it up. What's going on? So, failures, they're all through the Bible. Peter's situation. He couldn't walk on water as much as he thought he could. Argued with the Lord about going to Jerusalem. When the Lord's going around and washing each of the disciples' feet, Peter gets in an argument with Jesus about that. When he's following Jesus up to the last, he's following part of the way there, then he backs away, as you remember, when he's being put under inquisition himself, denies them. So our risk takers discovered that they're failures too. Everyone fails. Failure is universal. Failure, however, doesn't, number two, mean that everything's lost. Just because we fail doesn't mean we've lost everything, that it's final. And we can look at some of the characters that are described in here. We'll talk about them in just a moment here. But Proverbs chapter 24, verse 16. For though a righteous man falls 7 times, he rises again. But the wicked are brought down by calamity. And the emphasis is, and they stay there. Their failure is final because they choose to stay there. But it doesn't have to be. The sins that we commit in life don't have to come back and keep plaguing us and keep us from doing what we ought to do. And if we've tried certain things along the way that we thought were good and they didn't work out, and for whatever reason, whatever it is, that doesn't mean that we can't go back and try that again or try something else. So a failure doesn't have to be a finality. Now, a few characters along the way here that we know about here. One, during the early time of our founding of our country, lost 2/3 of the battles that he fought in the American Revolution. But George Washington did do pretty good in some of the other battles and winded up liberating our country and becoming our first president. There was another fellow that graduated 42 out of 43 in his graduation class. Doesn't sound too good. I mean, you're just right next to the very bottom. But Napoleon went on and conquered Europe just the same. So failures doesn't necessarily mean failures in every case. And it doesn't have to be final. There was a guy I was reading about, and you probably read about him too, that struck out 1,330 times in his lifetime playing baseball. Professional baseball player. But Babe Ruth did hit 714 home runs. And somehow that seems to stick more than all of his failures. Although 1/3 of the time he hit home runs, 2/3 of the time he struck out. gives us some encouragement here about these ups and downs in life, and a recognition of how Satan tries to put things out there to keep us from accomplishing our best. He says, let us not become weary. You know the rest of it, don't you? In doing good, or in well-doing, whichever your translation. For at the proper time, we'll reap a harvest if we do not what? If we do not give up. See, as we're going along the way, sometimes we look at what's happening and we're maybe there or not, maybe not there, you don't know. But as you look at that, you think, it's not working. I'm failing. And God says, don't give up. Don't become wearied by all the good things you're doing. You will reap if you don't give up. A lot of times we do, we call those failures. Well, it's true that a lot of us do give up quickly, and that's kind of the issue what we're talking about here. Let's talk about three things here on discerning the benefits of failure, because we do that a lot. We mentioned this a little bit in the class that we're studying on Sunday mornings as far as being proactive, but there's a good side to failing. Number one, if nothing more, you have tried, which is better than not having tried. You may have failed, but you did try doing something. You looked at what was out there, and if it was a good effort, and you saw it as something noble and that should be done, and you tried to do it. You put yourself out there. Maybe you put yourself out there a lot further than you normally do.